This house would accept refugees and stateless children into public schools in Malaysia. So this event is organized by Taylors and MIDP, and we're so happy to have you here. So on my right here we have Tariq on side proposition in favor of this motion. Let's give him a hand. And on my left here we have Salini, which is side opposition against this motion. Come on guys, you can do better than that. Let's give them all a hand. Alright, so before we begin this presidential debate, there are a few house rules that all of us need to adhere by. So number one, while this festival is primarily an English-speaking event, feel free to speak in Bahasa Malaysia, or you can also, give our Malaysian campo-campo if you're asking questions or whatsoever. Number two, we would like for every session to be a safe space for intellectual discourse. This does not mean that no one is allowed to disagree with each other, but you have to be respectful in doing so. Number three, if you'd like to reproduce any of the sharing by the speakers, please do so responsibly and avoid misquoting or taking them out of context. So for sharing from members of the audience specifically, the Chatham House rules apply, which means that you are free to use the information and experiences shared, but please do not reveal their identity. Number four, keep your mobile phones on silent throughout the session. You are not allowed to record the session. However, you may take videos or short clips for, IG story or Facebook story. Number five, as the BIM interpreters are seated on the right side of the hall, for those who prefer it, you may be seated closer to the BIM interpreters for a better view and access. Number six, you are encouraged to ask questions at the very end of the session. When the Q&A session opens, please raise your hands and I will call you out accordingly. So you can pay attention during the debate and write down any questions that you may have. And last but not least, this session is streamed live on digital platforms of MIDP and Astro Awani on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. So do share them to your friends and feel free to watch them. So without further ado, we're going to begin our presidential debate. So on my right side, I have proposition. Tariq, you may begin your opening statement. Give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Elise. Hi, glad to be here, glad to be invited to talk about something that's very topical, very important and relevant to something that I think a lot of Malaysians probably aren't so aware about because of the nature of stateless and refugees in this country. A lot of them tend to be invisible, and that is what the proposal that I seek to push forward seeks to address. I have three things to talk about. Firstly, what is our proposal? And I have two short arguments to make. One is that we would have them, as the motion suggests, be put into existing public government schools. However, for older students who may not be used to the current schooling system, they may initially be put into a separate transitionary class. I think that's already present today when it comes to students coming from SJK schools coming into public schools. There's already a system for that, just to get them used to the rules and the norms of these classes in general, right? So there are two, I also want to point out that as of 2016, right, the Ministry of Home Affairs stated that there are over 200,000 stateless children. Obviously that statistic is a while back. I think there's been more recent statistics, but it just gives you a sense of the scale of the kind of problem that we're trying to address here. Okay, I have two arguments here to make. Firstly, is the idea of equality. Secondly, is the idea of socialization. Firstly, I don't think this is that contentious, but I think this is a point that needs to be made anyway, is that in Malaysia, sometimes we need to push forward this idea that everyone should have equal access to public education, right? But I think more than that is that the reason why we're even having this debate is because we believe in this moral code that children, like each of our children, or not even our children, the future generation should have better than what we have today. And that's why we should try to make things better for them than what is currently available, right? The fact that most stateless children do not have access to schooling is a travesty. I think it's an injustice. And it's something that I don't think is something that you and I should be okay with. This idea that some child out there is unable to get used to the idea of, I've heard even that there are some stateless and refugee children who are not used to the concept of what tables and chairs are in classrooms, because they haven't been socialized to understand that different people have different seats, or different people have different assigned seats. Right. My second argument is about socialization, and this is a broader point, in that I think that one of the things that sometimes informs social stigma and prejudice towards people, especially refugees and stateless children, is ignorance. And what this proposal seeks to do is address that by making sure that these children, the stateless children, are socialized to average Malaysians, but also average Malaysian children are also socialized to stateless children. Now obviously, we would not have it so that these children are differentiated by who they are. But let's note first of all that in Malaysia, one of the ways in which, well, not just Malaysia, but anywhere really, one of the things that we use to be able to differentiate each other is one, our shared struggles, our shared memes even among children, memes like Mak Kau Hijau and stuff like that. Like those are the kind of things that bind children. And people who don't know those memes, you can already tell they're not from us, they're not of us. Similarly, for people who don't share a similar exposure to the same public school system, is a way for people to justify prejudice and discrimination against them because you know they're not of us. And so we think that continued exclusion of stateless and refugee children makes it harder, and we would like it so that they are more socialized and make it far less likely to have differentiators or us to be able to differentiate them from the rest of society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for your opening statement. Now we'll move on to side opposition. Salini, you may begin.
Thank you for the invite. You see, I agree. Right to education is very important. And it's not just crucial for upliftment or for the sake of, adhering to basic human rights standards of equality, but it's also important for survival. However, what I don't agree is to execute this through bringing them into public schools or through public education. What I would propose, right, my counter proposal would be, assuming the government has the readiness to help and a fair amount of funding, they should do this by funding private alternative learning centers, ALCs, or community learning centers, CACs. And in Malaysia, in fact, since 1970, we already have been operating ALCs and CLCs around the country, right? It's not new, it is lacking funding, and that's what we should change. And why is that the case? It's because I believe there's an inherent problem with public education, public schools that we can't change, which is public school is a one-size-fits-all solution. And the standardization that happens in public schools is something that we cannot remove, because if you want to operationalize something, you want to run something at a nation scale, right? It has to be standardized in terms of how you wear your uniform, what kind of uniform, what's the curriculum, what's the main medium of language to use. Without this standardization, like public schools would essentially fail and cannot serve its purpose. So going back to funding ALCs and CLCs instead, there are two factors that we can guarantee when it comes to giving education to refugee children or stateless children. The first one is adaptability. With the flexibility that CLCs and ALCs are able to provide, you can accommodate to these children who are not like any ordinary Malaysian children. They come with huge amount of trauma, they are forced to flee their homes, and there's significant language barriers. Some of them come from areas where they don't even use the Roman alphabet, right? So this is not something that an ordinary transition classes can accommodate to. There's a lot of psychosocial support structure that needs to put in place that you cannot do in public schools. And with the flexibility, different ALCs and CLCs can accommodate to different type of refugees who may have different struggles, right? And secondly, I would say that in terms of sustainability, this is where private ALCs, CLCs can accommodate the students better. How so? When refugees, children come in, it's not necessarily that their end goal is to resettle. They are not. They all have different end goals. Some of them would like to resettle in, let's say, Northern America or Europe, right? If they go to public school, they'll be tied to our national curriculum, which may not be beneficial if they want to resettle somewhere else. But if we were to send them to ALCs and CLCs based on their preference, that's when they can choose what kind of curriculum that they want to follow, right? For example, Dignity for Children Foundation, it uses IGCSE as the main qualification that allows these refugee children or stateless children to resettle into different countries. What would happen if we were to force stateless children or refugee children to stick to one standard? Let's say they follow like the Malaysian curriculum. We have seen this where previously, as CLC, before 2012, they follow the Malaysian curriculum, they use English, but when we switch the medium from English to Bahasa, they struggle, which means standardization doesn't work for them, and that is why today I would come to propose we give funding to private CLCs and ALCs instead of putting them in public school. Thank you.
Alright, thank you so much Salini and Tariq for their opening statements. So now we'll come to the time of the moderated rebuttals. Alright, so in Salini's speech, the thing that she mentioned most and the issue she focused on most was that public schools have often a one-size-fits-all solution, and this often leads to standardization. So I'm quite sure, Tariq, you might have something you want to address based on what Salini said on that.
Sure. I think that standardization is not a bad thing. I think that having a shared, that was the whole point of my point really, which is that having it standard means that we have a shared social experience. But I think more than that is, speaking to one of her other points about resettlement, is that resettlement usually takes years, and in the time in which these children will spend their time waiting for their turn to be resettled elsewhere, I think the question should be asked, who are they going to mix with in the meantime? Are they going to socialize with other Malaysian children? Or are they just going to keep to themselves? And I think that putting them in an environment where they only mix with themselves can be very dangerous to their ability to socialize and mix with other Malaysians.
Alright, thank you Tariq. So Salini, Tariq responded to that by saying that resettlement is something that takes a very long time. Not a lot of refugees and stateless children would often opt for that, maybe because of funds and things like that. So then he brought up his point again on like socialization, how it's harder for them to erase the prejudice towards them if they don't go into public schools. So what do you think about that?
I don't agree with that, obviously. I think the importance of resettlement is quite underrated at the moment, right? I think resettlement is actually very important, especially if, let's say, you are a refugee in a country that may not support your basic right. In that sense, your survivability means being able to move in a country that better protects your right, that gives you better access to basic services. I do admit that perhaps for the first few years, it will be difficult if you don't adapt to the local language. But let's be honest, if they go to public schools, it's not like they will immediately pick up the language, immediately be accepted. We have stateless children who went through Darjah 1 until Darjah 6, who can speak Bahasa perfectly fine, but they are still not being accepted just because on document they are not a Malaysian, right? In that case, I don't think we should lock their entire option of being able to move somewhere where they can be accepted just because we want to try to settle them within the first 2 to 3 years, for example.
Alright, thank you Salini. So Tariq, what do you think about what Salini said about resettlement and how this is something that is not that hard and sometimes refugees and stateless children should be given the option to do that?
Well, firstly, I don't think our education system is that bad. one. Two, I think that math and science is the same everywhere else. In that addition, division, whatever you learn in Malaysian schools, that is applicable, is stuff that you also learn in other places. Only stuff like Bahasa Malaysia, maybe our history or geography can be slightly different. But I think a lot of the things that we share in terms of even how we create our curriculum is based on how other countries do their curriculum. So I don't think it's fair for you to say that just because they're planning to resettle in North America or Europe, there will be vast differences in the curriculum that whatever they learn here can't really be transposed there as well.
Back on that, I would also like to ask another question towards Tariq, because Celine also mentioned in her response towards you previously that one of the biggest issues of incorporating these children is the language barrier. So what do you have to say about that?
I mean, that's what, when you say language barrier here or in the places where they plan to resettle?
No, she mentioned language barrier as in if these children are placed into public schools, they would have a language barrier in the sort of subjects that they're learning and maybe towards their peers.
I think that's a struggle that everyone goes through eventually, and this is a struggle that's true not only of stateless or refugee children, but also people for whom Bahasa is not necessarily their first language. So I think one of the things that I think I will probably stand behind is that shared challenges and shared, I guess, obstacles is what binds these children together. So like stateless and refugee children have something in common, I guess, with other people who don't have Bahasa as their first language.
All right, thank you. So Celine, Tariq mentioned that, language barrier is something that most children go through and it's not that big of an issue. How do you think his response to that clashes with your point on that, and also how you may respond towards the thing on him saying, how it's going to be easier for these students if they are placed in public schools so they can socialize?
Right, I think with regards to language barriers, Tariq is correct. Wherever you go as a refugee, or even like any ordinary children in Malaysia, right, there will be some levels of language barrier. Let's say, if you want to go to an English-speaking school or Malay-speaking school, you will still have to learn a new language based on that institution. However, what we're comparing here is the intensity of that language barrier, right? And at what environment will this language barrier affect you? Perhaps like the language barrier isn't such a big deal if it's only being used in class and it's a language that you are still exposed to in your ordinary day life. But when it comes to refugee children, that might not be the case. They may struggle to order food at the canteen, for example. They may struggle in communicating their emotions if they need support from their teachers or counselors. But I think more importantly, right, the point on the shared experience, spot on, Tariq. Shared experience is important. Having a good support structure is also very important for children who have to go through so much trauma. And this is where I would like to tie back to my proposal, where I think the shared experience in ALCs and CLCs, the support structure is much stronger. Let me give you a visual of what this looks like. So some of these CLCs and ALCs, they are also run by refugees themselves, whereby their instructors, their teachers also come from the same community. So these are adults who are not just trained to deliver curriculums, but they also understand what it's like to be a refugee. They understand the struggles that these children go through. Therefore, they are in better position to support these children. And I think in terms of creating a safe environment, given that your fellow classmates are also refugees, stateless children, it's a lot safer. You are less likely going to get judged, get mocked, in comparison where you are distributed across multiple public schools, right? You have children or teachers who are not sensitive towards your experience, so they may say something hurtful, they may not show up when you need support, and they may not understand when you need help and you are unable to ask for that help as a refugee children. So that's why I would say it's better if the government has the readiness for it and the funding for it. Fund these ALCs, fund the CLCs. They have the experience to provide the psychosocial for it.
All right, thank you, Celine. So Tariq, what do you think about Celine's point on how these shared lived experiences of these children would be better in these separate ALCs and CECs?
Well, firstly, I don't think that children are solely educated like in schools, right? I think that's one of the places in which they receive a lot of education. But I think a lot of the things that Selini talks about in terms of support structure, in terms of understanding from refugees, can be done elsewhere. It can be done at home, can be done like in counseling, whatever it is, but it doesn't have to happen in school. So I just think that where they are able to mix with other people, that's the priority there. Because I think the point of schools is not just for education, but it serves a purpose in terms of creating people who are able to relate to one another and to dissolve racial or class, I guess, differences. But I think one question I would actually really like to really ask here is, do you think the children themselves would feel content knowing that they're being excluded from mixing with other people in society as well?
Alright, thank you, Tariq. So, Selini, what do you think about what Tariq said on how these children will not be able to, have these interactions with citizens, children of, like, in Malaysia?
I think at that age, maybe it won't be seen as an exclusion, because let's try to put ourselves in that shoes and imagine what would it be like, if we were to go to a public school. Worst case situation, we might be severely bullied for being different, for speaking different, for having an accent, but like in a slightly better situation where we might still be excluded in the class because, people might not want to invite us back home to play with them after school. He, she looks different. I think exclusion will still happen regardless, right? And I would like to tie this back with what I said earlier. At the very least, in private ALCs and CLCs, people look more like you. They behave more like you, and they're more understanding and more empathetic. And as a children, maybe it's better to put them in a safe environment rather than trying to implement some national integration assimilation agenda, right? And if I may add, I think another important issue to also discuss here is, government's capability in supporting the refugees and stateless children. I'm interested to know how, Tariq would feel, how government might be better at executing national level public education policy.
Thank you, Selini. Tariq, would you like to address what she mentioned about your policy?
Wait. So just to clarify, what did you mean by that, Selini, like in terms of the national?
I mean, from a government's standing, is it easier to try integrate refugee children, stateless children into public school, or is it easier to facilitate fundings, for example, or have a G2G, government-to-government initiatives in creating funding for private ALCs?
I have two responses to that. Firstly, is that I actually do think it would be easier to integrate them within a national system simply through economies of scale, because it's given how many thousand stateless children there are, I think it would be easier for you to have them be integrated wherever they are, rather than to push them to go to whatever ELCs or CLCs you talk about, separate from these other schools, and to establish them as well. You can just use existing facilities. Yeah, I think that, but even if it were harder, I think it's worth it simply for the values I talked about earlier, which is, I guess, inclusion and not excluding them from the rest of society. Yes.
Alright, so one last question based on the policy and the proposal, right? So Tariq mentioned that, the challenge would be worth it. So I'm actually interested to know, like, what are the current challenges that are faced, in the funding or like the setting up of ALCs and CLCs for these children, and how you think, the government might be able to overcome it, and why then you think it's a better policy?
So the difference in challenges, right? In public school, the kind of challenges that you would need to overcome is training existing teachers to also provide emotional and psychosocial support, right? This requires like a lot of work, not just money. But the kind of challenges you face in ALCs and CLCs, you already have individuals that are dedicated to solving the issue, who cares about the issue. But what's standing in their way right now is the amount of funds that they have. They don't have funds, right? Or they lack funds. And I think that's an easier challenge to deal with. In fact, what we currently already have, we have Philippine embassies sponsoring certain ALCs and CLCs. We have an Indonesian government-run ALCs and CLCs in Malaysia, right? And I think with the presence of a government that's ready to do so, you can provide funding, you can facilitate the conversation between different governments within the region who wanted to help refugees and stateless children in our country. And I think just by explaining it, I'm sure it sounds a lot easier and simpler. And if I may add, right, the comparison right now here is, if you want refugee children and stateless children to go to public school, you are basically telling them they have to act like a Malaysian kid, they have to behave like a Malaysian kid. You are molding them and forcing them to become something else. And we're talking about children who are already forced to be courageous, who are already forced to be gritty, who are already forced to be resilient, right? But in comparison, by funding ALCs and CLCs, you're bringing education to them. You're creating an institution that fits who they are right now. And I think that's very important in helping children. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about children. The burden should not be on them to become more Malaysian and more acceptable. The burden should be on Malaysians to create that safe environment that welcomes them and help them as they are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Selini. So to the members of the floor, we'll be having our Q&A in 10 minutes. So as the debate is ongoing, the rebuttals are ongoing, you may write down any questions that you may have, and when the time comes, you will be given your opportunity to ask our fellow debaters the questions that you may have. Now, continuing on to our rebuttal session, so Tariq, what do you have to say in response to what Selini said?
I think, firstly, I think children are more resilient than we think. I understand Selini's point, is that these children have been through a lot, and it's difficult for us to expect them to go through more. But I would also ask, is it easier, just to echo something that Selini said earlier, is it easier for us to expect and to ask children to adapt to Malaysian norms, or is it easier for us to ask Malaysians to adapt to whatever norms these children are used to?
It's definitely easier to ask children to adapt, but that's not an action that can be successful easily, right? I mean, it's easy to burden push and tell the children, hey, this is on you. You're the one who's supposed to adapt. You should understand what is Makau Hijau, rather than being the adult that tells them, hey, this is what it means, right? Or like try to create jokes that is acceptable in their culture, learn, their ways and make them feel welcome and accepted. I would rather have that burden on Malaysian, especially adults, to have that acceptance. And I think this also supports an argument that I made earlier about sustainability of trying to create this change. Because, I mentioned there have been cases where stateless children did complete an entire sekolah rendah, but not allowed to take UPSR just because they don't have, a card or a birth certificate that says they are Malaysian. I think tolerance, at the end of the day, is more important than assimilation, because a refugee child or stateless child can only do so much if the adults or the Malaysians around them are not ready to accept them, are not willing to accept them, or don't even want to put in the work to build that tolerance, then it's quite pointless. And if that's going to be the situation, then don't bring them in public school, train them in a different curriculum, increase their chance at resettlement if we're not ready to accept them, if we don't have the tolerance to accept them. Thank you.
Alright, so the issue here right now is that in Selini's side, she thinks the burden should be on the adults, right? Not on these children themselves to make them feel welcomed. Whereas on Tariq, he feels that, these children should be placed in institutions where they have exposure towards citizens, children, where they are able to then have these shared lived experiences. So I have a curious question, right? It's a known fact that these refugees and stateless children, they often don't have the common shared lived experiences than normal children, right? For example, you mentioned memes, they don't have access to maybe social media or something, right? So how do you think then they would be able to curate these shared lived experiences with normal children in public schools? and instead not be, you know, like bullied and face the trauma that Selene was trying to talk about?
I think the word for this is osmosis, simply through mixing and talking to these kids. I think kids in general are not socialized to naturally discriminate against one another. I think they have a natural inclination to befriend one another, obviously there were no differences, and I know sometimes children can be cruel, but I think there's also instances in which children can really bond with one another. But I think one of the things I think Selene really points out, and I think it's a really important question, is that if people today, if adults today are not ready, the question I would ask is, what would you have done to make them ready 10, 20 years ago to accept refugee and stateless children today? Would you have had these children be put in separate institutions, or would you have had them as children mix around and see that stateless children are not like as vilified or as stigmatized as society would have us believe?
Alright, thank you, Tariq. So Selene, what do you think about that? How do you think that your proposal right now is making a change towards the tolerance that you were trying to talk about, that, you know, adults should have and the people in general should have towards these children?
I think it's important to note that for either proposal to work, be it integrating children into public schools or provide funding to ALCs and CLCs, government readiness has to be there, right? This is not something that, it can only exist, you know, if you put children in public school, or it can only exist if you give funding. This is like definitely step one that is required for both sides, or for both policies to work. And maybe that's something that, you know, we all can work for, you know, however we want. But at the end of the day, to Tariq's credit, integration and assimilation at some point need to happen. You know, it does have a unique value that it provides, it has to take place. How will it be different between Tariq's policy and what I would propose? So in his policy, he wants to try and see if this assimilation could be successful in schools, where he admits children can be cruel, and when we said children can be cruel, they can be very cruel, right? Or we could help nurture this refugee children, stateless children, to a certain level of emotional maturity or emotional safety, and only then facilitate integration or assimilation. What would this look like? For example, maybe they go to private ALCs and CLCs for Darjah 1 sampai Darjah 6 or the equivalent of it. Maybe like later in university or when they're a teenager, we try to create that assimilation or integration through external programs. Invite them to a debate competition, for example, or like have a moderated discussion and group activities, team building, and all of this can be done in smaller sizes, more curated, and more targeted depending on the different level of readiness to assimilate, right, by these refugee children. Rather than applying it like a blanket policy, masuk sekolah, pandai-pandai buat kawan, good luck, you'll do well, right? I don't think that's a safe way to approach, especially when we're dealing with children. You're right, children are resilient, but do they have to be? Is that really the burden we want to put on them?
Alright, thank you, Selene. So Tariq, what do you have to say about Selene's later integration proposal versus your earlier integration proposal?
I mean, honestly, I think it's a great idea, but I think that, I think the later we push it, the harder it gets sometimes, because, I mean, there is something to be said for having, there's a reason why we talk a lot about why kindergarten and preschool years are the most, very important years for the child's identity forming, right? It's because it's the formative years, and it's a lot of, so it's not just, my proposal doesn't just deal with the benefits for the stateless children, but also the benefits to the other Malaysian children and why it would help shape their identities to have exposure to these children at a young age. So it's not just for the benefit of these stateless children, but for other children as well. I understand that there may be obstacles and it may be painful, but I think a lot of growing up is really about working through those growing pains.
Alright, so we are at our last 3 to 4 minutes of our moderated rebuttal. So I'll give both opposition and proposition, one last chance to maybe like wrap up or answer any questions that were not discussed during the rebuttals and anything else you would like to address. So let's start with Selini.
Thank you. Right. I like that Tariq brought up, you can give external benefits, not just to refugee kids and stateless kids. That reminds me of the fact that it reminds me of the fact that if we were to proceed with funding ELCs and CLCs, the funding doesn't just benefit the children, but it benefits the community. Because at the end of the day, the ELCs and CLCs, they are run by refugees themselves. That means you're also training the adults to become better educators, equip them with skills that might be helpful to them when they resettle. They can become educators, they can become someone who assists this transitionary phase. And essentially, you're creating a more sustainable ecosystem on how do people react and respond when refugees come in and providing that particular support. But to a certain extent, I agree with Tariq. Maybe acceptance by Malaysian children need to be implemented, and perhaps that's something that is being deprioritized in my proposal. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Selini. Now, Tariq, the floor is yours.
I think Selini has a lot of great ideas, and unfortunately, because of the nature of the format, we have to oppose each other. But I think at the end of the day, the government has a duty not only to the most vulnerable people in society, especially children, but also to society in general. And so I think that, while I think that probably Selini's proposal does a lot, probably more to help stateless children, I don't think it does enough to deal with what it would do for Malaysian society and their socialization with these refugee children, which I think is one of the things that the proposal allows to happen.
All right, everyone, let's give a round of applause to our fellow debaters. Really awesome, didn't they? So right now is our moderated Q&A session with the audience. So after listening to what our fellow debaters have had to say about this motion, may I see a show of hands for anyone who has any questions to ask at all? Either to Selini, to Tariq, or just an open-ended question. Anybody? You can just raise your hands and we will have people pass you mics.
Hello, my name is Wala. My question would be more suitable for Selini, I guess, because I kind of agree that refugees should start their education in a separated institution, understanding that their circumstances are definitely different than the locals. And my question is, what would be the suitable age for the refugees to start their education? Because speaking from experience, I actually went to teach refugees children before, and their level of education is definitely different than the locals, because I was teaching like science and mathematics of standard 2 to 3 to refugees aged 11 to 12. So that shows like the gap. So yeah.
Thank you so much for the question, Wala. And it's an amazing thing that you do for those children. With regards to your question as to what age would be appropriate, I think this goes back to my point on how ELCs and CLCs are unique in a sense where they can accommodate to different requirements. And the requirements we're talking about specifically here is that age level and level of understanding, right? And that's why if we observe, different ELCs and CLCs in Malaysia, they have different curriculum, right? It's not like how in public school where if you're in Darjah 1, you have to be 7 years old. It's not like tied to an age. It really depends on their level of understanding, ability to read and write, and curriculum will be adjusted to them to match, their abilities, and those things will be assessed by the different groups, organizations themselves that run ELCs and CLCs. I know that doesn't directly answer your question. I think it merely provides context to help you understand the situation.
Alright, thank you Salini for answering. Thank you Wala for your question. Alright, we have another question up there.
Testing. Hello, my name is Hasbo. I'm a current year student. So I have a question for Tariq. So currently, our government already believes in and practices vernacular schools where students can learn and grow based on their best interests. So would a system which is designed specifically for these stateless children be better for them, assuming that it's already in line with the current beliefs and the policies of the government right now?
I mean, I suppose if it would be easy for them to be in vernacular schools where they can learn to speak Tamil or Mandarin, I suppose it would make sense. The point is that they should be attending government schools with other Malaysians. That's, I think, the broader point, I guess. That's, yeah. So, but broadly, I think the preference is to have them like attend like your general public, public school where everyone's speaking in Bahasa Malaysia generally. But if, for example, they may find it easier, I guess, to mix in that school, I guess, yeah, why not?
Alright, thank you Tariq. We have another question here.
Hi, my name is Priscilla. This question comes from me, who is actually a stateless person myself. Why would people like me be very, I'm sorry.
It's alright, no worries, take your time.
I just want to know, I found it out really in life, because I'm 17 now. Why the government isn't like doing more to like, how you say, to attend to people who are refugees and stateless people when they do have the money? And for me, I'm very like emotional when it comes to this, because I feel like for me, I am privileged enough to get an education in a public school, then transfer it to a private school, international school, sorry. And when it came to that time, I found out that I would be stateless. And why do the government not try to like promote these stateless, how you say, organizations? And why is it like that? Because I'm still waiting for the day that I would be able to get a passport and my IC, and it takes like, my mom said it takes like more than like 2 to 4 years, and I'm still waiting on it. And I just want to know, would there be hope it's that way? Because I'm still waiting.
Alright, thank you so much for your question. Before that, I want to say you're very, very brave for coming here and asking that question. So I feel like both Tariq and Salini would like to address this. Maybe Tariq, you can go first. Alright, Salini.
I'm sorry we failed you. I really am. You're not emotional. It's a very valid concern. Why does the government do that? Trust me, I'm also asking the same question. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are also asking the same question. Why are they not doing more when they can? And I suppose that's because there's lack of awareness and lack of tolerance, which is completely unfair. And I'm not sure how long this is going to happen, if it's going to happen forever. But what I would assure you, at least in this room, there's more than one person who's willing to do whatever they can to change that. And the fact that MIDP and Taylors are having this discussion is because they want to create that change. And hopefully people in your generation, assuming I'm old, would do better at carrying that mandate and creating that change.
Thank you, Salini. Tariq?
Yeah, Celine is absolutely right. I think, though, that there is hope. I think in the past few months, there's been a lot of movement towards, firstly, I think in the federal court, there was a recognition towards like, recognizing that mothers as well who are Malaysian can grant their citizenship to their children, so it wasn't just fathers before. That's one. Two, I think there was, I mean, it's kind of a qualified statement by the education minister to say that stateless children can attend public schools provided that one of their parents is Malaysian. So in the sense that prior to this, there was very little movement on it in terms of Malaysian awareness or Malaysian, even at the political, at the ministerial level. I think now there's at least a lot more awareness and a lot more movement towards, I think, you getting what you really want out of this.
Alright, thank you, Tariq. We can take one last question as our session is almost ending. Does anyone else have the last question?
Hello, my name is Kwe. I'm 19 and I'm a student at Taylor's. My question will be directed for both Selini and Tariq. Because from a refugee and stateless children point of view, you are coming into a place where you're not familiar and you don't have an established identity or community that can help support you in this place. You have a new language barrier and a social barrier and even a currency barrier, economic barriers, that prevent you from just simply accessing things for free or just going up to someone and be able to access it. How would both sides be able to how would both sides have a mechanism for providing that these people coming to Malaysia are able to access education adequately? And my second question is related to that. Even if there's a mechanism to enable people to enter into the systems, how would they slowly let people in step by step? Would there be a filter process? Would there be a background check? Or would you let people in regardless of qualification, age, or background? Thank you very much.
Alright, maybe Tariq, you'd like to respond to that first?
I mean, so I don't think I'm able to really detail out to you a white paper policy right now, but I would fathom that I think my initial policy indicated that even for like initial students, especially older students who may have trouble integrating with the public school system, there would be an initial period in which they would be in a classroom, right? So there would be, so I'm asking you a second question first. In the sense that I think that there would be ways in which you would try to really sift out, I think the word is triage, where people would go in terms of what school, what level they would go to. Of course, they would have its own challenges. In terms of your first question then, in terms of access to education, I think the challenges that refugee and stateless children face is the same, like if they were to resettle elsewhere, they would still face the same challenges in terms of language barrier, how do you communicate, how do you get used to the system of like the buying, selling things, even in the supermarket, that kind of thing. So I think that I think both of us are not really against access to education. It's just a question of how do we achieve it and how do we achieve those goals of education. Whether or not education is simply like, I think both of us agree that it's also, there's a social element to it. There's a part in which we allow these children to exist in a space in which they're able to interact with other people in a safe way.
Alright, thank you, Tariq. Selini?
Correct me if I'm wrong, if I were to recap your question, the first one is how does it help? How does the proposal help? And secondly, what's the step-by-step process, right? So again, to preface, not an expert of this, it's a layman's opinion, right? But for my proposal, how it could help is if you know, some of the CLCs and ALCs, where they are established, is usually nearby a specific community of stateless individuals and refugees. And what would usually happen is that the kind of curriculum that they have, or the kind of, how they run the centers, would usually a reflection of how the community operates, right? Because the essential goal that they have is to help the closest community to them and accommodate to them. And I guess in that way, that's how they help the integration happen, whereby they accommodate to that specific community. For example, in Indonesian government-funded CLCs would focus more on how do they help Indonesian migrant children, something along that line. But in terms of a step-by-step, what I know here is that there are some CLCs that just accept students Of course, there will be some screening, but not screening in a way whether you deserve or don't deserve to be there, but rather on what's your level of understanding and skills so that I know where to place you in terms of your level. But there are also other ALCs and CLCs that accept students who hold UNHCR cards, right? So they make it as a requirement. If you hold a particular card, then you can access our education system or accept any other services that is related to UNHCR.
Alright, thank you Selini. This marks the end of our Q&A session. So before we end, just a brief summary of what was discussed throughout this presidential debate. On Tariq, in favor of this motion, he talks about, reducing stigmatization, removing the ostracization, helping these children to assimilate and, socialize better and perhaps have a better life from being in contact with normal citizens of Malaysia. Whereas on Selini's side, she talks about the problem with the standardization of public schools, and she says that, by putting them in separate institutions, this provides flexibility, adaptability for them. It's more sustainable for them in the long run. So hopefully everyone gained something out of this debate. You learned something. It made you think a little bit more about this issue and perhaps how you could contribute as well and raise your awareness as well. So thank you all for attending our presidential debate of YouthPact 2023 by Taylors and MIDP. We hope you all have a great day ahead, and I will pass the time next to the moderator of the next session. Thank you so much.
Alright, thank you so much everyone for coming and staying throughout the whole session. Please don't go anywhere yet. I have a few quick, very important announcements to make. The first announcement is, please scan the QR code for the session. The QR code on the right is for your feedback for this current session. So please everyone take out your phone, scan this QR code and let us know what you like or not like about